As educators, we have heard the words culturally responsive teaching over and over again. Many professional development sessions and discussions have been centered around diversity issues, how we must celebrate it, incorporate it into our teaching styles and lessons, and be cognizant of how our backgrounds and experiences can shape how we teach and assess our students. In graduate school, we take minimal classes on psychological development and physiological development. I don't think I did take a class in that at all. We touched on it a little bit in developmental psychology. And we learn very minimally about the brain and how it works in relation to learning. Following the emphasis of what was stressed in my graduate classes has shaped me immensely. Only now, as I'm completing this Read Oregon program, have I been exposed to more research about neuroscience and how the brain learns to read. It's difficult to not feel overwhelmed by all the research about neuroscience and how the brain learns and processes, and to make sure I'm incorporating all of that into my lessons and I'm being culturally relevant and sensitive to my students' backgrounds and needs. But not until I read Zaretta Hammond's book, Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, written in 2015, have the two been married together in an in-depth breakdown of how teachers can use research in neuroscience to inform their teaching to promote cultural responsiveness. Hammond proposes a framework entitled Ready for Rigor, which is comprised of 4 essential key areas teachers may use as a blueprint for cultural responsiveness: awareness, learning partnerships, information processing, and community of learners and learning environment. Hammond uses various research to support each of these key ideas, ranging from neuroscientific to theoretical practices. While I am convinced from reading her book that she has thoroughly investigated the validity of her framework, I will be investigating articles and research in neuroscience to conclude the legitimacy of her framework. Can Hammond's framework be as effective without a neuroscience perspective? Let me go through Zaretta Hammond's Ready for Rigor framework. So, like I said before, there are 4 components to it. The first one is awareness, and under awareness are different bullet points, and I'm going to read them off. One is to understand the 3 levels of culture: recognize cultural archetypes and individualism and collectivism, understand how the brain learns, acknowledge the socio-political context around race and language, know and own your cultural lens, recognize your brain's triggers around race and culture, broaden your interpretation of culturally and linguistically diverse students' learning behaviors. The next part is learning partnerships. So the bullet points are: reimagine the student and teacher relationship as a partnership, take responsibility to reduce students' socio-emotional stress from stereotype threat and microaggressions, balance giving students both care and push, help students cultivate a positive mindset and sense of self-efficacy, support each student to take greater ownership of his or her learning, give students language to talk about their learning moves. The next one is information processing. Provide appropriate challenge in order to stimulate brain growth and increase intellective capacity. Help students process new content using methods from oral traditions. Connect new content to culturally relevant examples and metaphors from students' community and everyday lives. Provide students authentic opportunities to process content. Teach students cognitive routines using the brain's natural learning systems. Use formative assessments and feedback to increase intellective capacity. And the last part is community of learners and learning environment. Create an environment that is intellectually and socially safe for learning. Make space for student voice and agency. Build classroom culture and learning around communal sociocultural talk and task structures. Use classroom rituals and routines to support a culture of learning. Use principles of restorative justice to manage conflicts and redirect negative behavior. Okay, so now let's go into talking about the brain itself. We're going to be listening to a YouTube video by Robert Sapolsky. It's titled 3 Brain Systems That Control Your Behavior: Reptilian, Limbic, Neocortex.
A gazillion little subregions. Amid all that complexity, there's a broadly sort of simplifying way to sort of think about aspects of brain function when it comes to behavior. And this was an idea put forth by this guy, Paul MacLean, a grand poobah in the field, conceptually of thinking in the brain as coming in three functional layers, the triune brain. And again, this is highly schematic. The brain really doesn't come in three layers, but one can think of the firstmost, the bottommost, the most ancient as being what's often termed the reptilian brain, where basically the parts in there, we've got the same wiring as in a lizard, as in any ancient creature. It's been there forever, ancient wiring at the base of the brain, most inside. And what does that region do? All the regulatory stuff. Your body temperature changes, it senses it and causes you to sweat or shiver. It's monitoring your blood glucose levels. It's like releasing hormones that are essential to sort of everyday shopkeeping. It's just, keeping regulatory stuff in balance. Sitting on top of that is conceptually what could be termed the limbic system, the emotional part of the brain. And this is very much a mammalian specialty. Lizards are not well known for their emotional lives. Part of the brain having to do with fear, arousal, anxiety, sexual longings, all those sorts of things, very mammalian. You're off there in the grasslands butting heads with somebody else with antlers, and it's your limbic system that's heavily involved in that. Then sitting on the top is the layer 3, the cortex. The cortex, spanking new, most recently evolved part of the brain. Everybody's got a little bit of cortex, but it's not till you get to primates that you got tons, and then apes, and then us. So functionally, it's very easy to think of this simplistic flow of commands. Layer 2, the limbic system, can make layer 1, the reptilian brain, activate. When is that? Your heart speeds faster, not because of a regulatory reptilian thing, ooh, you've been cut, something painful, but an emotional state. You're a wildebeest, and there's some scary, menacing wildebeest threatening you in your and that emotional state causes your limbic system to activate the reptilian brain, and your heart beats faster. You have a stress response, not because a regulatory change happened in your body, but for an emotional reason. Then it's very easy to think of layered on top this cortical area commanding your second layer, your limbic system, to have an emotional response. Rather than something emotional, here's a threatening beast right in front of you, something emotional, you see a movie that's emotionally upsetting. See a movie. These are not real characters, they're pixels, and it's your cortex that's turning that abstract cognitive state into an emotional response. Likewise, your cortex, layer 3, could influence events down in layer 1. You see something upsetting, you think about something, you think about mortality. One of these days my heart is going to stop beating, and your heart's going to beat faster. You're not bleeding and hypotensive, you're not in some hypoglycemia. Nothing in the reptilian brain could make sense of this. A purely cognitive state, ooh, on the other side of the planet there are people undergoing some traumatic event, and I feel upset about it, and your reptilian brain responds. So it's very easy, given that, to think of a 3 talks to 2 talks to 1 sort of scenario. Just as readily, though, 1 talks to 2 talks to 3. What would be a case of that? What's your reptilian brain talking to your cortex? Remarkable finding. When we're hungry, we make harsher moral judgments about people's transgressions. We're less charitable. We cheat more in economic games. Our cortex, assessing the effects of pro-sociality, anti-sociality, and altruism and its evolution, and part of what it's doing in deciding how it feels about somebody else's plight is if your stomach's gurgling, if you're hungry, if you're in pain, that affects very cortical judgment type areas. Layer 1, this ancient reptilian brain that should have nothing to do with how your cortex works, having tons to do with it. Or layer 2, influencing layer 3, your limbic system, your emotional state, influence your abstract cognitive processes. What's the most obvious example of it? When we're under stress, when we're in an emotionally aroused state, we make stupid, impulsive decisions that seem brilliant at the time. Affective, emotional, limbic layer 2, influencing how your cortical cortex goes about its abstractions. It's not that abstract. It's embedded in the biology of all these layers. This interaction between these layers, seems this very mechanical process, potentially even an unconscious one. How do we consciously have, say, our cortex regulate an emotion, a limbic 2 layer? Simple. Think about the most arousing, wonderful thing that ever happened to you umpteen decades ago, and your cortex is evoking a memory that's got your limbic system humming along in some excited state. Or think cortically, or pull out the memories of some traumatic event, and your limbic system is responding. How about reptilian level? Easy to make it get into an agitated state. Sit there and think about something incredibly upsetting. Think about some memory that was truly disturbing. Think about mortality. Think about global warming. And your heart speeds up. Layer 3, in a very conscious way, has mobilized layer 1. A lot harder is the inverse. You're sitting there and you suffer from high blood pressure, and either they could marinate you in antihypertensive drugs for the rest of your life, or an alternative approach, a biofeedback approach, is sit there and think about the happiest day of your life. Think about being in an open field that's beautiful. Think about your favorite vacation. Think about, and if it's the right thinking about, suddenly your heart slows down. Suddenly your blood pressure goes down. The core of biofeedback is figuring out what sort of conscious states you can evoke that will affect your reptilian brain in a direction that's good for your health. And all you do then is learn how to get better and better in some stressed, hypertensive circumstance. What conscious active thinking can I mobilize here at this point that will cause changes in how my big toes blood flow is working? In a case like that, that is very conscious regulation of more autonomic, more ancient parts of your brain.
So part of accessing the framework is to first understand culture. So culture, according to Hammond, as it turns out, is the way that every brain makes sense of the world. That is why everyone, regardless of race and ethnicity, has a culture. Think of culture as software for the brain's hardware. So there are different levels of culture. There's surface culture, which is stuff that a lot of teachers do that I thought I was doing in the past that was like really great and I'm being really culturally responsive, but it just turns out it's complete surface culture. It's a lot of observable and concrete elements of culture, like food, dress, music, and holidays. Um, Shallow culture is the next level, and this one is made up of unspoken rules around everyday social interactions and contracts and norms, such as courtesy, attitudes towards elders, nature, friendships, concepts of time, personal space between people, nonverbal communication, rules about eye contact or appropriate touching. So the things that, like, if you were to travel to a different country, you wouldn't exactly know how to greet somebody, and then you would have to assimilate and observe how they're interacting with each other to understand that level. Then comes deep culture, and according to her, this level is made up of the tacit knowledge and unconscious assumptions that govern our worldview. It also contains the cosmology view of good or bad that guides ethics, spirituality, health, and theories of group harmony. Deep culture also governs how we learn new information. Elements at this level have an intense emotional charge. Mental models at this level help the brain interpret threats or rewards in the environment. Challenges to cultural values at this level produce cultural shock or trigger the brain's fight or flight response, as you learned about in the 3 major layers in the brain. Also, this point touches on the models of schema. Those are the models that are reflective in Hammond's work. The point is that one's culture, especially one's deep cultural roots, is part of how the brain makes sense of the world and helps us function in our environment. The worldview continues to guide our behaviors even when we change our geography. We call these mental models schema. So also part of awareness is knowing your own cultural lens, really taking the time to dissect where you come from, your ethnic background, how that influenced the way that you learn to teach, how you were taught, what are ways that work best for you as a learner. So like for me, I'm just thinking about differences about visual learners. Like, of course, kids really love pictures. We go through books and look for pictures to have a better understanding of what they're learning about. But today, because everything is so visual with the use of technology, kids are much more reliant on it today, and this has definitely shaped the culture of learning in the classroom. It's also extremely important to take the time to build rapport in your classroom, because if you don't know your students, get to know them as individuals and take that time, not just like straight off the bat trying to get into all of the academics, you're not going to be able to access the ways that they are able to learn best. I'm going to go in later about information processing and the community of leaders and learning, more about the environment that teachers can set up to create that safe space. Because if students aren't feeling safe, the parts of their limbic system is going to be responding in a different way that is going to make them less susceptible to information processing. A strategy that can be used for awareness is to do some inventories or surveys where you connect with the family that can help identify different cultural archetypes within your classroom. Which one is more dominant? Is it more of an individualism-based classroom, or is it more about collectivism?
Okay, so the next part of the framework is learning partnerships. So neuroscientists have identified that we are hardwired to connect with others. Our nervous system is designed to guide us towards avoiding threats, approaching rewards, and things that will make us feel good, and attaching to others for safety and companionship. So we've seen a lot of movement towards like think, pair, share, turn and talks, a lot involving social interaction that helps the brain interact with the different parts of the layers, which can then store information into long-term memory, which is ideally the goal. According to Gay, I did some research on her culturally responsive papers, and she says that modeling is imperative to teaching, her methods of teaching, modeling how we think, modeling our process, showing metacognitive strategies to students is imperative for when teaching culturally responsive material frameworks. The brain is a very social organ, as I was just describing, and it's created to connect and to interact with others. Also, another part that we need to be aware of is collective cultural practices have reinforced this natural tendency and deepened the brain's hardwiring for relationships. The system encourages social bonding through the release of hormones such as oxytocin, where in the presence of others. So just knowing about that chemical being released in our brains ties into this really interesting study that I found from Sasaki in the Nature, Nurture, and Their Interplay, a review of cultural neuroscience. The main researcher states, cultural neuroscience research examines how psychological processes are affected by the interplay between culture and biological factors, including genetic influences, patterns of neural activation, and physiological processes. So in a research study that they did a lot of more genetic research, and it does apply to the brain, but they found that two people that had different, they're called alleles, of the serotonin transmitter polymorphism, some that had shorter ones were able to not produce as much oxytocin as others, and that would eventually lead to higher rates of depression. So I think just kind of going back to the awareness piece of just understanding, has a student of mine been through some trauma, experienced something where that it actually would shift their genes and brain structures that would lend them to being more susceptible and more triggered to certain topics or ways that you're approaching them from your cultural perspective.
I thought it was also really important to touch on this aspect that the brain will not seek to connect with others if it perceives them to be threatening to its social or psychological well-being based on what they say and they do. That's why I was just thinking about like some drama classes that I did in high school, and why did we spend so much time doing these like stupid games where we were like physically interacting with each other? But I'm looking back and I'm realizing it's a way of building trust within the classroom dynamic, and I'm really appreciating that now in hindsight. I just wish maybe my teacher had mentioned at the time, because I'm like, why are we all like running around playing tag and stuff? We're in 11th grade, but now I'm getting it.
The next part of the framework I'm going to be talking about is the information processing aspect. We'll be touching on white matter and how that affects persons who have been diagnosed with dyslexia. We'll also be talking about the reticular activating system, RAS, executive functioning, and short-term and long-term memory. something that really struck me was when the RAS is a really critical brain feature that's responsible for alertness and retention and attention. If you can get students, this plays into the classroom because if the teacher is starting a lesson off, it's kind of like a paper. You want to start off with a bang. You want to draw readers in. You want to draw your audience in. So if you can activate your students' RAS system, it's going to direct the attention learner to the beginning of a task, which also helps the brain stack information. So you can organize it better, and students are able, or their brains are able to automatically discern between information, whether it needs to go in short-term or long-term memory, and the other factors that will help drive information into long-term memory, which is ultimately what we want as teachers. For white matter, if you think about your brain as a sort of highway system, so if this part of the brain is trying to interact with this part of the brain, and someone who, for instance, has dyslexia, the highway that if the white matter is traveling on is not necessarily a straight path. It could be narrowed, it could be kind of skewed or bumpy. So the way of remedying that is teaching certain strategies, like doing checklists, organizational skills, repetition. That is a way that the brain is able to restructure itself to have a more linear pathway, so learning is easier for that student. Also, executive functioning, which is extremely important, especially for my population, the life skill population that I have right now. Executive functioning is the command center of our brain. It oversees our thinking, it manages our working memory, it controls planning, abstract thinking, organization, and self-regulation. It also houses our imagination. So if we can be playing in, knowing that this information about from neuroscience plays into the framework, and that if we understand best how our bodies process information best, then we are able to construct our lessons to awaken and access different parts of the brain to then hold it into long-term memory. So short-term memory is estimated between 5 to 20 seconds. Working memory is up to 20 minutes. And when the brain is learning something new, it clusters neurons together, which will create a neural pathway, kind of the pathway I was talking about that the white matter travels down with dyslexia. It's similar to a footpath through a forest, as Hammond says. Neural pathways are important because when we go back and forth along this pathway, when we're thinking or we're problem solving, we're accessing different parts of our brain, it helps drive newer learning deeper into long-term memory until it becomes automatic or deeply understood. So if we're thinking in a reading context, that's why it's really important to involve background knowledge, because it's marrying the new information that they're learning and able to apply it to something in long-term memory, and then they're able to connect to each other faster. I read some more from Israel and Duffy. They did a handbook back in 2009, research and reading comprehension, and they did a very interesting part about working memory. So until adolescence, children show poor performance on memory processing tasks than adults. One hypothesis is that the actual storage space of memory increases with age. Ties to Hammond into the information processing is that we can teach students cognitive routines using brain's natural learning systems and accessing background knowledge, like I mentioned before. And the next part we'll be learning about more community routines and whatnot. But they made some good points about reading comprehension strategies. Like we talked about before, you want to activate and use prior knowledge to interpret text, relating text context to prior knowledge, reconsidering and or revising prior knowledge based on text context. So that's part of that building intellectual capacity. They're able to take that information and reference it against what they've already learned and then make adjustments like, oh, I'm expanding upon that, or, oh, I'm actually wrong, that's incorrect, and I need to kind of erase that, delete that, and then insert some new information. Attempting to determine the meaning of words not understood or recognized, especially when a word seems critical to the comprehension of a text. So the brain being able to recognize repetition in a word, and then teaching those skills of possibly teaching Greek or Latin roots or suffixes and prefixes, so that if that memory is that's stored in long-term memory, then they're able to go back and access that and break down words and use strategies such as that. Adding on to the memory part, Hammond says, when we don't practice or use new dendrites shortly after a learning episode, so creating a new neural pathway, our brain prunes them by starving them and then reabsorbing them. It assumes that if you don't revisit the activity that grew the dendrites, that information wasn't important to keep. So that's when your brain is making the decision to check out that information. the footpath gets overgrown and disappears, making it hard for you to find your way back to stored knowledge and to skills. So that's where spiraling and doing maintenance and doing repetition and choosing to build on skills that are done in a formulaic way, not just like, oh, I'm teaching you this skill and this skill and this skill. It all has to have some sort of interconnectedness to build. That's how your brain absorbs information best. The last part of the framework we're going to talk about is the community learners and the learning environment. So as we all know, it's very important for students to have routines, for you to establish clear expectations and routines, especially in the beginning of the school year. It's important to take that time to teach those routines so it creates the brain is able to process information where it knows the blueprint and the outline of what's to happen, but what happens in between that creates like a safe space for the brain to process the information and to learn within that routine. In a paper by Richard, Intellectual Character, What is it, Why it Matters, and How to Get it, he states, routines also play an important role in shaping and directing the intellectual space of the classroom. These thinking routines are simple patterns or structures used over and over again that support and scaffold specific thinking moves or actions. In relation to theory, at the top level, we ground our work with thinking routines in an enculturative model of dispositional development, which views thinking and more specifically the disposition toward thinking. So it's creating a safe space for students to then be able to be in a place to actually learn. This ties into fluid intelligence as well. Thinking routines using cognitive strategies. The explicit nature of thinking routines is often evidenced by having names or labels, such as brainstorming, webbing, pros and cons lists, KWL charts. That allows us to easily recall the thinking moves involved and put them in play. As we have shown, these labels often name the steps of the routines itself, such as like think, pair, share. So creating those mental routines is very important to establishing how students are going to learn within that framework. Of course, another really important aspect is to make space for student voice, doing Socratic seminars, creating an environment where they know the expectations, they know that this person needs to ask this question and this one is going to answer this one, and setting kids up for success with these structured routines. Also, it's important for in terms of behavior management, which is like half of what I'm doing or pretty much my whole day, and then we get to teaching. But just kids being able to know exactly what are the expectations and how can you structure behavior management around social norms that are equitable to that particular student. Do they align with something at home, or is it important for you to teach the skill that the student needs to, they act this way in one environment and this way in another environment, and being able to go back in between those two. It's kind of like behavioral code switching in a way, being able to teach that skill where there are clear expectations and having those set routines and behavior management techniques established where the student knows where they stand. That creates a safe space, and that will tie into everything that we've been talking about. So if that student doesn't feel safe or nurtured or comfortable, then no learning is really going to happen. And especially in special ed, we say, if the behavior gets worse before it gets better, and until the behavior is under control, no learning is going to happen. So it's very important to set up those behavioral norms within your classroom and be cognizant that it's going to be done in a way that's culturally responsive to your student.
So my key findings were all that everything that I learned about neuroscience does directly play into Hammond's framework, and I think it's a great framework, and I definitely will be using it in my classroom, constructing my lessons around making sure there's social interaction. I'm getting to know my students. I'm building that rapport with them. I'm understanding where they're coming from, where are their families from, and what are their backgrounds in terms of, are they more of an individualistic culture, they're looking out for themselves, or it's more of a collective environment. That was really important to learn about the different levels of culture, understanding cultures, and being able to reflect on my own practices, like, oh, I'm such a great teacher because I have everyone fill out a questionnaire about where they're from, and we do research projects about food and their background and stuff. But now I'm learning that it's so much deeper than that. So it's extremely important to understand. I couldn't find any research that disputed anything that she said. And what we should be taking about learning from Hammond's book and all the neuroscience developments is that we know how the brain likes to learn, so we should be constructing our lessons to foster that, to completely play into the brain, to completely cater to it, and getting to know our students, to respect and acknowledge that we're all individuals and we all learn differently and we come from different backgrounds, and that's not something that should be ignored or exploited. It should be just, we should just know about each other and just process it and implement it into our lesson construction, our topics, behavior management, our expectations for our students, and just that it's a complete, the brain is forever evolving just like our practices are, and we just need to keep involved in the science and see how that relates into teaching.